Welcome, dear listeners, to another episode of Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, we're going to take a long, peaceful journey back in time, to the story of the Transcontinental Railroad. Imagine the vast, open plains of America in the 19th century, the whistle of a steam engine in the distance, the rhythmic clatter of iron wheels on steel tracks. This is a story of ambition, engineering, and human effort, a story that connected a nation. So, settle in, close your eyes, and let's drift into the past, slowly, calmly, together. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, was a marvel of its time. It stretched across the United States, from the bustling cities of the East to the rugged frontiers of the West. Before its completion, traveling across the continent was a grueling, months-long ordeal, by wagon, horseback, or ship. The railroad changed everything. It stitched together a growing nation, made trade faster, and brought people closer. But the story isn't just about steel and steam. It's about the people, thousands of workers, dreamers, and planners, who made it happen. Tonight, we'll explore every detail, from the first dreams of a coast-to-coast railway, to the golden spike that marked its completion. Let's begin where all great stories start, with an idea. In the early 1800s, America was expanding. The Louisiana Purchase had doubled the nation's size, and settlers were pushing westward. But the West felt far away, almost like another world. Crossing the continent could take 6 months by wagon, through treacherous mountains and deserts. Ships sailing around South America took even longer. People dreamed of a faster way. A railroad, a ribbon of iron that could carry passengers and goods from the Atlantic to the Pacific. It was a bold idea, but it wasn't easy. The country was vast, the terrain unforgiving, and the politics, complicated. Let's take a deep breath, and step into this story. Let's go back to the 1830s. Railroads were still new in America. Steam locomotives were chugging along short tracks in the East, connecting cities like Baltimore and Philadelphia. But the idea of a railroad spanning thousands of miles? That seemed almost impossible. The United States was a patchwork of farms, towns, and wilderness. There were no roads through the Rocky Mountains, no bridges over the wide Missouri River. Yet, a few visionaries began to dream. One of them was a man named Asa Whitney, a merchant who traveled to China and saw the power of trade. Whitney believed a railroad could link America's coasts, making trade with Asia faster and cheaper. In 1845, Whitney presented his plan to Congress. He proposed a railroad from the Great Lakes to the Pacific Ocean. He spoke passionately about commerce, about uniting the nation, about progress. His words were like seeds planted in fertile soil. But Congress, well, they weren't ready. The country was divided, North and South, free states and slave states. Politicians couldn't agree on where the railroad should go. Should it start in a northern city, like Chicago? Or a southern one, like New Orleans? The debates dragged on, and on. Let's pause for a moment, imagine the endless meetings, the stacks of papers, the arguments over maps. By the 1850s, the government decided to study the problem. They sent surveyors, brave men with compasses and notebooks, to map possible routes across the West. These surveys were slow, methodical work. Surveyors climbed mountains, crossed rivers, and braved harsh weather. They drew maps of the prairies, the deserts, the Sierra Nevada. Each route had its challenges. The northern route was cold and mountainous. The southern route was hot and dry. Every option seemed daunting. But the surveys gave hope. They showed that a railroad was possible, if only the nation could agree. Then came the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862. The country was in the midst of the Civil War. The South had seceded, and the North saw a chance to act. President Abraham Lincoln signed the bill, authorizing 2 companies to build the railroad. The Union Pacific would start in Omaha, Nebraska, heading west. The Central Pacific would begin in Sacramento, California, heading east. They would meet somewhere in the middle, a meeting that would change America. The government promised land grants and loans to fund the work. It was a massive undertaking, one that required vision, money, and countless hands. Let's linger here for a moment. Imagine the map spread out on tables in Washington, the lines drawn in pencil, tracing paths through unknown lands. The Transcontinental Railroad was no longer just a dream. It was becoming real. But the work ahead, it was monumental. Let's drift forward now, to the people who would make it happen. Now, let's picture the year 1863. The Civil War rages in the East, but in the West, the railroad is taking shape. The Central Pacific breaks ground in Sacramento. Shovels dig into the earth. Workers lay the first wooden ties. The Union Pacific begins in Omaha, marking the start of their journey west. The work is slow at first, almost meditative. Each company faces its own challenges. The Central Pacific must conquer the Sierra Nevada, towering mountains with granite walls and deep snow. The Union Pacific crosses endless plains, but faces hostile weather and Native American resistance. Let's explore their stories, one step at a time. The Central Pacific relied heavily on Chinese immigrants. Thousands of men, mostly from Guangdong Province, came to California seeking work. They were skilled, tireless, and willing to take on dangerous tasks. They carved tunnels through solid rock, using picks, shovels, and sometimes explosives. The work was grueling. Workers dangled from ropes on cliffs, chipping away at stone. Winters in the Sierra Nevada were brutal, snow piled high, temperatures plummeted. Yet, the Chinese workers pressed on. They built tunnels like the Summit Tunnel, a marvel of engineering. Imagine the sound of hammers, tap, 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 echoing through the mountains. It's a steady rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. The Union Pacific, meanwhile, hired Irish immigrants, Civil War veterans, and freed African Americans. Their work was different but no less demanding. They laid tracks across the Great Plains, where the land seemed endless. They drove spikes into wooden ties, one spike after another, a repetitive motion. The wind howled across the plains, and storms could halt progress for days. Native American tribes, like the Cheyenne and Sioux, sometimes attacked, fearing the railroad would destroy their way of life. The workers built fortifications, carried rifles, and kept going. Each mile of track was a small victory, a step closer to the west. Let's pause to imagine the daily life of these workers. They lived in camps, tents or rough shacks along the tracks. Mornings began early, with the clatter of tools and the smell of campfires. Breakfast was simple: beans, bacon, maybe coffee. The work went on all day, laying ties, hammering spikes, leveling the ground. At night, workers gathered around fires, sharing stories or songs. It was hard, repetitive work, but it had a rhythm, a kind of music. The railroad was growing, mile by mile, across mountains and plains. The companies competed fiercely. The government's land grants rewarded progress. The more miles built, the more land and money they received. The Central Pacific and Union Pacific pushed their workers harder. By 1867, the tracks were stretching farther. The Central Pacific cleared the Sierra Nevada, while the Union Pacific crossed Wyoming. They were racing toward each other, though they didn't know exactly where they'd meet. The landscape changed with every mile, rivers to bridge, canyons to cross, deserts to endure. Let's linger on that thought. The slow, steady progress, like waves lapping at a shore. The workers faced incredible dangers. Blasting accidents killed dozens in the tunnels. Avalanches buried camps in snow. Disease spread in crowded camps. Yet, the workers kept going. The Chinese laborers, in particular, were paid less than their white counterparts, but their skill was undeniable. They invented techniques for blasting tunnels, using nitroglycerin with precision. The Irish and black workers on the Union Pacific built bridges over rivers like the Platte, using timber hauled from distant forests. Every task was a small piece of a larger puzzle, a puzzle that would connect a nation. By 1868, the end was in sight. The companies were closing in on Utah, a rugged territory where the tracks would meet. The race intensified. Workers laid tracks at astonishing speeds, sometimes 10 miles in a single day. The Central Pacific set a record on April 28, 1869, laying 10 miles and 56 feet of track. Imagine the scene. Hundreds of men moving in unison, hammers swinging, spikes driven into the earth. It was exhausting, but exhilarating. The nation was watching, waiting for the moment when East would meet West. Now, let's drift to May 10, 1869. A quiet place called Promontory Summit, Utah. The Central Pacific and Union Pacific tracks are just a few feet apart. A crowd gathers, workers, engineers, politicians, and reporters. The air is crisp, the sky wide open. This is the moment America has been waiting for. Two locomotives, one from the east, one from the west, face each other. A golden spike, specially made for the occasion, is ready to be driven into the final tie. It's a symbol of unity, of progress, of a dream fulfilled. At 12:47 p.m., the ceremony begins. Leland Stanford, president of the Central Pacific, steps forward. He swings a silver hammer to drive the golden spike. The crowd holds its breath. The hammer strikes, and the spike is set. A telegraph operator sends a simple message across the nation: done. Church bells ring in San Francisco. Cannons fire in New York. The Transcontinental Railroad is complete. Let's imagine that moment, the quiet joy, the sense of something monumental finished. The railroad was 1,912 miles long, stretching from Omaha to Sacramento. A journey that once took months could now be made in days. Passengers could board a train in New York, connect in Omaha, and arrive in San Francisco in less than a week. Goods, wheat, cattle, machinery, moved faster than ever. Towns sprang up along the tracks. The West became less wild, more connected. But the story isn't all triumph. The railroad displaced Native American tribes, like the Lakota and Shoshone, whose lands were crossed by the tracks. Their way of life was forever changed. Let's reflect on the workers. The Chinese laborers who toiled through mountains were often overlooked at the ceremony. Their names weren't recorded in the official accounts. Yet, their work was the backbone of the Central Pacific. The Irish, black, and other workers on the Union Pacific faced their own struggles: low wages, dangerous conditions, and little recognition. The railroad was a monument to their labor, a monument that still stands today. The Transcontinental Railroad reshaped America. It boosted trade, making California's fruits and Nevada's silver available nationwide. It encouraged settlement, as families moved west to start new lives. It also sparked new industries: steel, coal, and manufacturing thrived. But it wasn't perfect. The companies faced scandals over corruption and mismanagement. The land grants enriched a few, while workers and Native Americans paid a heavy price. Let's sit with that thought, the balance of progress and cost, like a quiet moment at dusk. As we drift toward the end of our story, let's think about the legacy of the Transcontinental Railroad. By the 1870s, it was part of a growing network of railways across America. It inspired other nations to build their own railroads, from Canada to Russia. It changed how Americans saw their country, no longer a collection of distant regions, but a single, connected nation. The railroad became a symbol of possibility, of what humans could achieve when they worked together. The railroad also had darker legacies. The displacement of Native Americans led to conflicts, like the Indian Wars, and the loss of traditional lands. The environmental impact was significant: forests were cut for ties, and buffalo herds dwindled as trains crossed their paths. Yet, the railroad also brought new opportunities. Immigrants from Europe and Asia arrived in greater numbers, drawn by the promise of work and land. Cities like Denver and Salt Lake City grew because of the tracks. Today, the Transcontinental Railroad is a memory, but its tracks still carry freight and passengers. Amtrak's trains follow parts of the old route, winding through the same mountains and plains. Museums, like the one at Promontory Summit, preserve the story of the Golden Spike. The railroad reminds us of a time when America looked to the future, when a bold idea became reality. Let's imagine standing at Promontory Summit today, the wind whispering across the tracks, the past echoing softly. And so, dear listeners, we come to the end of our journey. The Transcontinental Railroad, a story of dreams, labor, and connection. From the first sketches on a map to the final spike in Utah, it's a tale that shaped a nation. As you rest tonight, imagine the sound of a distant train, its whistle fading into the night. The workers, the engineers, the dreamers, they're all part of this story, and now, so are you. Thank you for joining us on Boring History for Sleep. If this story helped you relax, drift off, or simply pass the time, we're glad to have been here with you. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let the rhythm of the rails carry you to sleep. Good night, and sweet dreams.